Hey, this is Joe from Home Studio Corner. Let's talk about mixing vocals, specifically using EQ. As I thought about how I've evolved my vocal mixing process over the years, kind of honed in on three things that have really helped me, and that's what I want to share with you today, these three rules for how to EQ vocals. So let's just dive into the first one, shall we? Rule number one, listen to what everyone else is doing. I know, I'm a musician and I march to the beat of my own drum. I don't need to listen to nobody. Well, yes, I want you to do you, but if you would agree that there are some standards that we all kind of expect to hear when we listen to music, then it makes sense that you would pay attention to what is happening out there in your iTunes and Spotify libraries. What do the vocals sound like of your favorite albums from your favorite artists, mixers, and producers? Chances are we're a little bit earblind to what we do, and a lot of times what we're doing doesn't really sound a lot like what they're doing. And it's generally just a matter of waking up and realizing it. So for me, I love the sound of a big, full, warm, beefy vocal. I love, when I get to sing into a big, expensive tube microphone into a tube preamp and it makes me sound all big and beefy. I love it. Beef. For example, here is a vocal that I recorded at a friend's studio through, I believe it's a $5,000 microphone, through, I think, another $1,500 tube channel strip. It sounds pretty great by itself, nice and beefy. Here we go. Look how far we've come. Our mothers would be proud. That's a cool sounding vocal, but in a mix with everything playing, the whole band, that vocal's got a lot of low end. It's got a lot of muddiness down there, that kind of woo, woo, woo sort of frequency that's gonna cause problems. And when I go listen to my favorite albums, whether it's more chill acoustic stuff, straight up rock, pop, or anything in between, even country, I'm not hearing a vocal that sounds this warm and this muddy. Yeah, this is great for a raw track, but I need to use EQ and maybe a high pass filter and an EQ to tame this down to something more reasonable. Specifically, I remember listening to a playlist of kind of the most popular pop songs at the time, and every one of those vocals, the thing I noticed was they were bright, there wasn't a ton of warmth, they weren't harsh, they sounded great, and they weren't overly sibilant, meaning they weren't so bright that when the singer sang an S or a T, it chopped your face off. It didn't sound like there was a big boost in the upper frequencies. It just sounded like the vocal didn't have excessive warmth and muddiness, which allows it to sit right on top of that mix, which is what we're all trying to do. That leads us to our second rule. Rule number two, hold off on boosting, especially in the highs. So like I said before, I was listening to major label releases and then listening to my vocal mix, and my vocal mix sounded a lot warmer. I would go so far as to say I kind of preferred my sound over theirs. So I had to have a little bit of a come to Jesus moment of, if every vocal across different genres doesn't sound as thick as mine, mine's probably the problem. Mine's probably too thick, I'm too close to it, I need some perspective, hence these references. And I'm not even talking about sitting down and listening to the reference, then listening to my mix, then listening to the reference, then listening to my mix. I'm talking about I go to the grocery store to grab a six-pack, and I'm just listening to music on the way, and I'm just making note of how the vocals sound. I'm just paying specific attention to the vocals. Then when I come back to my studio and listen to mine, and I say, mine's a lot thicker, that tells me something and I can get to work. So the big thing that I realize is, for the most part, my job with the vocal, to take this vocal, is to make it sound more like that vocal. And generally that's going to happen by doing more cutting of frequencies than boosting. For example, this vocal right here, if I slap an EQ on here and I boost the top end, here's what we get. Look how far we've come. It sounds a lot brighter and cooler, and of course, brighter is generally better to our ears, but that low end that was there that I just played for you before, the muddiness, that's still there. It hasn't gone anywhere. We've just added some highs on top of those lows, and it's still a problem. So rather than doing that, I would do something like this. Look how far we've come. Our mothers would be proud. Still has some warmth. It's not this, right? It's not completely lacking any life at all. Look how far. It's not that, but it's also not this sort of a sound either. It's a happy medium. There's a balance. There's a one spot in there where you've taken away enough of that want, but you've left enough warmth to keep the vocal sounding cool, right? And remember, depending on the mix, if it's a big, dense mix with lots of guitars and other stuff, that vocal can be even thinner than this, and it's probably going to work out just fine. But in my experience, time and time again, mixing hundreds and hundreds of vocals, I found when I just go in and start boosting stuff, I generally make more problems for myself than when I first kind of find those frequencies that are misbehaving and tame them down a little bit. Then I can still maybe go boost the top end. A lot of times I might still need to do that, but after I've kind of tamed what's happening in the lows and the low mids and the mids. Make sense? Rule number 3, know your zones. When I think about EQing a vocal, my mind typically divides that up into 4 sections of tone that are fairly different from one another. So back in rule number 1, we talked about listening to other vocals to help us identify the problems in our vocal. Well, now we need to divide that vocal up into zones and figure out where the problem lies so we can go into that zone to fix it, if that makes sense. To demonstrate those 4 zones, I've pulled up the Multiband Dynamics plugin in Studio One. This is a multiband compressor, but for this, I'm just using it so I can isolate the different zones so we can listen to them and hear what they sound like. So the 4 zones are, the bottom zone is from 0 to 250 to 300 hertz. This is where, on the good side, a lot of your warmth comes from, but on the bad side is where a lot of the mud comes from, okay? And that zone sounds like this. There's a lot of deep low in there, but there's a whole lot of like that kind of pokes through. That was what we were trying to fix earlier when we applied that EQ. Now, without those frequencies, the vocal can sound pretty empty. Look how far. So we need some of them there, but when there's too much of them, it can sound muddy. Zone number 2 goes from 300 to 1K. This is a very mid-range sort of zone. And in my brain, I think of that as a place where you get some resonance of the vocal. A lot of kind of the fundamental frequencies of that vocal, not the muddy stuff, but kind of the notes that are being sung, typically are residing in this range. And it's an important range. If you get rid of it, the vocal can sound super wonky. Look how far we've... It's got that kind of smiley face EQ sound, all lows and all highs and no mids. We need the mids, but we need to be careful with how much are there. If we get rid of them too much, it sounds like that and sounds weird, almost like a jacked up hi-fi stereo system. But if we have too much of them, things can sound kind of muffled. Here's what those frequencies sound like by themselves. Look how far we've come. Very similar to, it used to be really popular to do like a telephone effect on a piece of a vocal. Basically means removing a lot of the lows and the highs and just leaving that mid-range. Don't do that, it's overdone. But those frequencies, while they don't sound great by themselves, they're important to the mix and to the vocal to kind of give it a little bit of resonance. And so it sounds like a natural voice. If we get rid of those, it's bad. If we have too much of that, the vocal can sound kind of hollow and just kind of muffled sounding. Okay, zone number 3 for me is kind of between 1 and 6K, and that's kind of the clarity zone. A lot of the sibilance of the vocal, a lot of kind of the timbre of the voice, the grit of the voice, the clarity to understand what the person is singing, a lot of that happens in 1 to 6K. So there's clarity on the good side. On the bad side, it can make things sound harsh or nasally. Nasally is kind of the main thing that I think of when I think of this range. Here's what that range sounds like by itself. Look how far we've come. It's only prominent on some of the louder vowel sounds. If we get over here to the chorus where I'm singing louder, you'll notice there's more information happening in this upper mid-range zone. I know I can hear you. And as you can see, that sounds kind of nasally, and if you're not careful, that can make the whole vocal, all you hear in the mix is that frequency, which we don't want. Of course, if we remove all the high mids, the vocal sounds weird too. I know I can hear you. There's a lot of information in the high mids that we need to be there. If we remove it, something's wrong. Okay, zone 4 is up above that. So 6K and up. This is where, when things are going great, this is where that air is, that nice, crisp top end, silky top end that we dream about. That happens up here. Obviously, if there's too much of it, it can sound really harsh and strident. There's not tons of information here, just in a general raw vocal, but once we've EQ'd and then compressed, that tends to have some prominence in our vocal sound. Here's what those highs sound like by themselves. So it's a lot of that crispiness. You saw when I boosted the vocal earlier with the EQ, it was those frequencies I was boosting. The whole vocal maintained its general character and sound, but those highs, those sparkly top ends came out quite a bit. That's where a lot of the sibilance can happen as well. Here's what happens if we don't have enough of those highs. I know I can hear you. Sounds like an old recording through bad mics and bad cables through a really long cable run onto a tape machine, and then just a lot of signal loss. We lost a lot of top end. We need the top end there, but as I said earlier, if you go boosting this top end too quickly, too early, you're just going to add on to the problems you have rather than going in and handling some of the stuff that's happening in the mid-range, which is generally where a lot of the problems are. All right, this is the kind of video that annoys some people because I don't give them a specific formula of cut this frequency, boost this frequency, and you'll have a great vocal every time, because that doesn't exist. But in general, the things that I've shared in this video, that's the way I approach every vocal, whether it's me, whether it's a spoken word vocal, whether it's a female vocal, whether it's a loud vocal or a quiet vocal. I'm thinking in terms of the things we talked about in this video. If you'd like to learn more about mixing, specifically my 5-step mixing process, which gives you kind of a roadmap for here's where I'm starting my mix and here's how I know when my mix is finished, you'll love it. Check it out at 5stepmix.com. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.